Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Rethinking C&Q, How Iteration and Operational Readiness Accelerate Product to Patient. I'm Heather Masaccio, your host from Pharmaceutical Online. I have just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have a question for our speakers or wish to share any thoughts of your own, please submit it through the Q&A box on your screen. Our speakers will address those questions at the end of the presentation today. If you run into any problems with the stream today, please try refreshing your browser first. If that problem persists, go ahead and use that Q&A tool to submit a question, and I'll help get you back on track. This event will be available on demand. You'll receive a link via email as soon as it's available. Now on to our speakers. Today we are joined by Eric Collier, Global Director, CQV, Center of Excellence, CAI, and Paige Kane, PhD, CPIP, AVP, Operational Readiness, Operational Excellence, also with CAI. We're going to kick it over to Eric to get us started. Eric?
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about a different way of thinking about commissioning and qualification, one that's grounded in existing industry guidance, but applied in a more modern, practical way. Most of us have experienced projects where C&Q becomes a late-stage bottleneck. Testing piles up near mechanical completion, schedules compress, deviations increase, and everyone feels pressure at exactly the wrong time. What we want to explore today is how that happens, and more importantly, how to prevent it. The core idea is simple but powerful. By using iteration and operational readiness, we can move verification earlier, distribute effort more evenly, and reduce late phase congestion without compromising compliance or quality. This is not about shortcuts, and it's not about ignoring regulatory expectations. In fact, what we'll show today is that this approach is fully aligned with ISPE Baseline Guide 5 and GAMP 5 when those guides are applied as written, not as traditionally interpreted. By the end of this session, my goal is for you to see C&Q not as a project phase, but as a continuous life cycle activity that accelerates product to patient while strengthening assurance.
So let's start off with a poll. So Eric, I think we had a good conversation, good opening here. So let's find out from the audience, how many people are still relying on the way we've always done it, the sequential, document-heavy C&Q workflows. So typically we do the verification at the end of the projects in these sessions. So let's go ahead and give everybody a few minutes here to let's just see where people are. I'll probably give maybe 30 seconds or so, if that makes sense, Eric.
That's fine. Perfect.
Okay, yeah. So I'm interested to see where we get here. I didn't come in with a hypothesis, though, so we should have come in with a hypothesis, Eric, and then we can test it.
I think it's going to be over 80%.
Okay, super.
But I could be surprised.
Okay. Let's give it about 5 more seconds and then we will see the results. Okay, let's see. Ooh, you should have bet me, Eric.
I should have.
Excellent. Okay.
All right.
So very, very interesting. Let me hand it back over to you and let's get on with it.
All right. Thank you. All right. Let's start by outlining what we'll cover in this session so you know where we're headed. First, we'll talk about why C&Q so often ends up on the critical path. This is a shared pain point across capital project, and it's rarely caused by a single failure. It's usually systemic. Next, we'll walk through iterative specification and verification, what that really means in practice, and how it differs from traditional waterfall validation models. This is where many misconceptions exist, so we'll try to be as concrete as possible. We'll then connect these ideas explicitly to ISPE Baseline Guide 5 and GAMP 5, showing exactly where iteration, early verification, and vendor leveraging are clearly supported. After that, we'll introduce operational readiness as an enabler, making iteration possible. Without readiness of people, processes, and data, iteration collapses back into waterfall. And finally, we'll cover practical steps, things you can do on your next project or even an active one without re-engineering your quality system. This session is meant to be pragmatic, grounded, and immediately usable. To understand why this topic matters, we need to look briefly at how we got here. Over time, validation in our industry evolved into a document-centric compliance exercise that wasn't irrational. Early retrospective validation and Part 11 concerns pushed organizations to prove control through documentation created after the fact. But those behaviors became institutionalized. Waterfall delivery models reinforced delayed verification, and risk aversion often translated into more documents, not better assurance. The unintended consequence is something many of us recognize. C&Q becomes synonymous with paperwork. Success is measured by document completion rather than system readiness or fitness for intended use. In some cases, documentation volume actually reduces quality. Errors are harder to detect, reviews become superficial, and real risk gets buried. This is not about blame, it's about recognizing that our current pain points are the logical outcome of historical practices that made sense at the time, but now limit our ability to deliver efficiently. The good news is that industry guidance has already evolved. What hasn't evolved at the same time is how we apply it. That's what the rest of this session addresses. So why does C&Q end up on the critical path so often? One of the biggest contributors is batching, particularly large engineering turnover packages. When information arrives in big chunks, verification simply can't start until everything is done. That forces sequential behavior. Documents are reviewed in series, testing follows documents, and everything stacks up near mechanical completion. Mechanical completion then becomes a convergence point for unresolved design questions, incomplete documentation, and unexecuted verification, exactly when schedules are under the most pressure. Late discovery is another key issue. When verification is postponed, issues are discovered late when fixes are more expensive, vendors are disengaged, and change management rigor has escalated. None of this is usually caused by poor execution, it's caused by when we choose to verify. If verification can only happen at the end, then C&Q will always be on the critical path. To change that outcome, we don't need more heroics, we need a different delivery model. The insight comes from looking outside traditional validation models, particularly at agile delivery in regulated software environments. In Agile, requirements, design, and verification happen continuously. Teams don't wait for everything to be finished before they test. They test as soon as something is testable. The same principle applies here. Verification does not need to wait for final documents. It needs to wait only until design intent is sufficiently defined to test risk-relevant aspects. When verification starts early and proceeds incrementally, several things happen. Bottlenecks smooth out, late phase congestion drops, predictability improves. Most importantly, C&Q efforts shift upstream off the critical path. That's the real benefit. This doesn't require abandoning rigor, it requires changing timing, not standards. The rest of the presentation is about what enables this shift and how to execute it responsibly in regulated, inspection-ready environments. Iteration requires a fundamental mindset change, especially around documentation. In an iterative model, requirements, specifications, and verification evidence are living artifacts, not static deliverables. They evolve as design matures and understanding improves. That doesn't mean losing control. It means maintaining continuous traceability rather than freezing documents prematurely. Digital tools are critical here. When traceability is maintained electronically, updates happen in a controlled and transparent way. We no longer need to wait for perfect documents to begin useful work. Instead, we work with the best information available, execute verification when it's meaningful, and update artifacts as changes occur. This aligns very naturally with how projects actually progress. Design evolves. Suppliers refine configurations. Risks become better understood over time. Living artifacts allow validation to reflect reality, not an artificial snapshot created late in the project. This is one of the most important conceptual shifts in iterative C&Q. Continuous verification is where iteration really becomes tangible. It simply means we stop waiting for the right phase to test and instead verify as soon as design intent is intestable. That can happen during construction, FAT, SAT, or commissioning, wherever meaningful evidence can be generated. The key is that verification follows test readiness, not document completion. When we adopt this mindset, a major shift occurs. Instead of everything stacking up near mechanical completion, verification work is spread across the life cycle. By the time mechanical completion is reached, some portion, and in some cases, a substantial portion of verification may already be complete. This eliminates the high-risk scenario many teams are familiar with: compressed schedules, overlapping reviews, and pressure to execute large volumes of testing in a short window. That's where mistakes, deviations, and quality compromises tend to appear. Continuous verification doesn't increase testing, it redistributes it. The same rigor applies, but it's applied at the right time when systems are accessible, vendors are engaged, and corrections are easier to make. The outcome is less stress, better quality evidence, and a much more predictable project closeout. All right, and I'll pass it over to Paige.
Super. Thanks, Eric. When we talk about continuous verification, operational readiness is what really makes this possible, because without it, the iteration will collapse back into that waterfall behavior that I think we're all familiar with. So readiness is not just about systems, it's about people, process, data, and governance being prepared to really support that verification when it's technically feasible. So if the procedures don't exist, or the training isn't planned, or the data ownership isn't clear, the teams are then forced to wait, even if the equipment is ready to be tested. I'm sure you've all been there, right? So what happens is that delay pushes verification downstream, and it just recreates those bottlenecks that we were trying to avoid in the first place. So when operational readiness is established early, that verification can move upstream. So that's in parallel with some of the other things that are going on, and those dependencies then are removed. So instead of C&Q being one of those late gates, it becomes really more a contributor, giving feedback into the system, detecting issues early, and supporting informed decisions. Operational readiness to me is not an add-on, it's really a prerequisite for iteration. So when it's built in from the start, then we can accelerate the schedule by enabling the right work at the right time. So let's talk about some inputs into operational readiness. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires some very direct forethought. We need to ensure that the SOPs are developed early and people are clear in their roles, because we need to understand how to operate and control our systems before the verification begins, not during or after. The data governance is equally critical. Teams need early agreement on what data would be generated, where it's going to live, how it's going to be reviewed, and how it's going to be approved. Without that early clarity on this, the verification can be chaos instead of generating additional value. I think another key input is how we agree on using the vendor testing, the FATs and the SATs. How will they be treated? Will they be informal or informational? And if so, then the value is lost. Why would we not capitalize on that testing that's already been done? So that can be a powerful accelerator when we proactively think through that, make the plan, and organize that to happen. And then I think the last piece of this is the digital workflows. When we can leverage our digital workflows and we can use more of our digital tools, we can really review these things incrementally without losing control and traceability. So our digital systems do provide amazing traceability and trace matrix. So when these inputs are in place, the readiness is there, and it really enables this continuous verification approach. Let's talk a little bit about Baseline Guide 5. So that totally supports what we're doing today. It emphasizes a science and a risk-based commissioning and qualification approach, and it explicitly encourages engaging with the engineering activities like our construction checks, our FATs and SATs as a part of that verification. The guide also introduces critical aspects as a focal point for the verification effort. So instead of just, we could call that the peanut butter approach, right? Testing everything the same, the effort is directed towards the features that protect the product quality. Also, Baseline Guide shows how those lifecycle activities connect from the requirement specifications through the risk assessments, the design review and verification, rather than taking them as isolated phases. And it was intentionally written and designed to support early, meaningful verification to reduce redundant testing. So when Baseline Guide is applied as it's intended, it really enables an iterative execution. So when organizations adopt this early verification approach and leverage vendor testing, we can really use Baseline Guide 5 as it was intended. So let's talk a little bit more about critical aspects. They are central to the concept of modern commissioning and qualification. They define what truly needs to be protected to manage our product quality and our patient safety risk. So again, as we said, instead of verifying everything, we really want to focus on product quality, safety impacts, or our patient safety. So those really need to be our true north of what we're focusing on. So that shift improves efficiency and also our quality. And we can decrease the actual volume of testing when we're testing the right thing at the right time. And the verification then becomes more meaningful and it's actually more defensible. So critical aspects also enable better timing, because when we know what matters the most, we can verify those elements as soon as they're testable rather than waiting for the system level completion. And I think this goes right back into the concept that Eric talked about earlier, that we're doing this iteratively versus batching when we're waiting for documentation and we're waiting for everything to come at the end. So vendor testing is often underutilized. The FATs and SATs are performed, but sometimes the results are treated as more informational. However, when we understand our suppliers' quality systems and we assess them, that vendor testing can be used directly to support qualification. And this eliminates that redundant testing and allows us to identify issues earlier. we certainly want to address issues as soon as we find them and have the things in motion so we can rectify that and move along with our testing. So when properly planned, we can move that boundary between commissioning and qualification. We are accumulating the evidence of our testing sooner rather than reacting later. So again, this is not a shortcut. We have to evaluate this with a risk-based approach. We use our change control and we have clear expectations on how we're going to use that testing. So I think leveraging our vendor testing is one of the most effective ways that we can shift our effort upstream. Now, GAMP5, this is near and dear to my heart. I was on the original GAMP5 author team, and I was on the second revision of GAMP5. And I feel like sometimes we still are misunderstood that a waterfall methodology is the way that it's prescribed. So that is really not what the guidance intends. And as a matter of fact, even the labels on the testing aren't as intended. So the second edition explicitly states that verification and specification verification do not need to be sequential. Those activities could be iterative and scalable as long as we are supporting that with a risk-based approach and we're being governed by an appropriate quality system. So more importantly, GAMP positions validation as a life cycle activity, not as a final phase. So I think that's an important concept. So specifications, risk assessment, and verification are expected to evolve as understanding increases. Now, and I will tell you, that's not just a GAMP idea, right? That is, if you look at the industry guidance in ICHQ 10, again, we are expected to evolve and improve as our understanding increases. But bringing it back to C&Q, I don't think this is an interpretation stretch. I think it's a direct application of the principles that we already have. And the framework allows for iteration. So the next question is, how do we apply judgment within that framework? And again, this is another topic near and dear to my heart. And we actually put the topic of critical thinking into GAMP5 because we felt that we weren't doing it enough and we were not doing the best testing we could because we stopped thinking about it and we put labels on it. So critical thinking doesn't mean that we're using less rigor. It means that we're directing it to where we need most. So we need to think through, we need to understand our critical aspects, and we scale the testing based on the risk and the patient risk as well. So this helps us avoid verification because we always do a document called this, a document called this, and a document called that. That's not what we want. The critical thinking helps us think through the testing controls, the procedural controls, and the human performance elements that we need when we design our testing approach. And when teams consider this holistically, I think the verification becomes stronger. We can reduce our redundant testing and our timelines will shorten. And I think it puts us in a much better position for inspection readiness. So this mindset shift is very important to iterative C&Q in our real environments on the plant floor. So let's talk a little bit about supplier documentation. The supplier documents are a major accelerator to our verification activities when it's used correctly. The specifications, configuration records, and supplier test results often satisfy the needs that we have when we have them. So early access to this information helps us identify issues sooner, and that's when we want to use this because the suppliers are still with us and they're still engaged and we can get into those corrective actions earlier. So when suppliers are involved throughout the life cycle, our readiness improves and we can have a big reduction in our surprises, which we do not want when we're in this phase of our testing. So I think, Eric, this will be my last slide and then I'll hand it back to you. Pharma 4.0. So digitalization is a very powerful enabler for iterative C&Q. It's not the goal, but it's a really great enabler because it helps connect everything, and it allows us to capture a lot more evidence when we generate things earlier, and it helps keep everything aligned. Our trace matrices and things that we have in the systems are absolutely fantastic. And when we can connect the requirements, the risks, and the verifications, and things get updated automatically in the system, it helps us eliminate that late stage reconciliation that many of us have had when we're putting these packages together. The digital commissioning tools also support real-time execution during construction, FAT, SAT, and commissioning without waiting for these packages. And it doesn't replace judgment, but it really helps support it. Again, we want to use that risk and science-based approach. And when we do that, it makes our packages much more defensible. And I think looking forward, DVT and our digitization of these tools and testing really help us align with the Pharma 4.0 principles. So Eric, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Paige. This slide is intended to convey the idea of building evidence over time across an iterative life cycle. It illustrates how evidence can be accumulated progressively, but it's not intended to serve as an example directly for a life sciences industry. The requirement specification is established early to define intent, but it can be refined as design decisions mature and understanding improves. We're not constantly rewriting requirements. We are clarifying and sharpening them as risk becomes better understood. Risk assessments follow the same pattern. Initial risks are identified early, but they may evolve as new information becomes available from suppliers, construction, and testing. Treating risk as a living activity allows verification to remain aligned with what actually matters rather than what mattered months earlier. Design reviews and design qualification also become iterative. Instead of a single large gate, assurance is built through targeted reviews tied to maturity and risk. Most importantly, verification is executed continuously as elements become testable. Evidence is generated when it is strongest and most representative of actual system behavior. The practical outcome is progressive evidence accumulation. By the time mechanical completion is reached, qualification is well underway rather than just beginning. This fundamentally changes schedule risk, resource loading, and project stress. To make this more concrete, consider a stick-built Wi-Fi storage and distribution loop, which is a verification-intensive system on many projects. One simple example of the broader opportunity is vendor-supplied calibration certificates. Instruments for a Wi-Fi loop typically arrive with calibration already performed by the manufacturer. These certificates are reviewed for range, accuracy, traceability, and suitability, but on many projects, that review is deferred until mechanical completion simply because it's bundled into a final turnover package. The delay is rarely risk-based. The evidence exists the moment the instrument arrives. The acceptance criteria are already defined, yet verification waits, not because it has to, but because that's how we've always sequenced the work. In an iterative C&Q model, those vendor calibration certificates are verified as part of receipt and installation activities. The certificates are reviewed when the instruments are received, confirmed against the intended service, and accepted immediately. No standards change and no additional work is created. We simply stop waiting for unrelated construction activities to finish and development of comprehensive test protocols. And calibration certificates are only one small piece of the Wi-Fi loop. For a stick-built Wi-Fi system, many critical verifications can occur before mechanical completion. Material certificates for product contact piping, weld logs and orbital welding parameters, borescope inspections, surface finish records, pressure test results, and installation checks for valves, spray devices, and instruments. These verifications are tied to specific components and segments of the loop, not necessarily to overall system completion. When those verifications are performed incrementally as the work is executed, the system is steadily being verified rather than queued up for a single late-stage event. By the time mechanical completion is declared, some installation verification is already completed, and in some cases, a large portion may be completed, depending on the system scope and project execution approach. This removes a hidden dependency that routinely adds weeks of pressure to the back end of C&Q. Mechanical completion stops being the moment when verification finally and instead becomes a confirmation that most of the critical evidence is already in place. What's important here isn't vendor calibration certificates, weld records, or material certs individually. It's what they represent. Stick-built systems like Wi-Fi loops are full of verification activities that are independent of overall system completion. When these activities are delayed, C&Q is artificially pushed onto the critical path. Identifying and executing these verifications as soon as the evidence exists is one of the fastest, lowest risk ways to pull C&Q left without increasing regulatory risk and without increasing validation effort. When verification moves earlier in the life cycle, the benefits accumulate quickly and predictably. Schedules compress, not because work is skipped, but because work is no longer congested at the end of the project. Verification effort is distributed more evenly, reducing late phase overload and firefighting. Issues are identified earlier while systems are accessible and suppliers are still actively supporting the project. That matters because once installation and SAT are complete, suppliers often move on to other projects, making corrective action slower, more expensive, and far more disruptive. Rework and deviation volumes may also increase. Many deviations are not caused by poor technical execution, but by rushed execution under severe schedule pressure. When verification timing improves, quality improves naturally. Testing quality itself becomes better. Tests are more focused, better planned, and reviewed with appropriate attention rather than under deadline stress. Just as importantly, team behavior changes. Stress levels drop, collaboration improves, and outcomes become more consistent from project to project. Early verification is not just a scheduling tactic, it's a structural improvement to how quality is delivered. Adopting an iterative C&Q approach requires a deliberate cultural shift, and that shouldn't be underestimated. First, teams must move away from milestone-driven document completion and toward continuous evidence flow. Evidence is created, reviewed, and approved as work progresses, not gathered at the end. Second, organizations must become comfortable with rolling reviews and progressive approval. Waiting for a complete package before engaging is replaced by continuous participation. Third, digital systems must be trusted as the authoritative record, rather than viewing them as a temporary workspace until a final PDF is created. That shift can feel uncomfortable, particularly in environments shaped by long inspection histories. However, once teams experience that control, traceability, and transparency actually improve, that comfort fades quickly. Cultural change is often the hardest part of iteration, but it's also the most powerful. When the mindset shifts, the mechanics tend to follow. Iteration also demands organizational changes in how teams collaborate. Traditional sequential handoffs are incompatible with continuous verification. Engineering, C&Q, QA, and operations must work as an integrated team throughout the lifecycle rather than engaging in isolated phases. Verification informs design, and design informs verification timing. QA involvement is particularly critical. When QA is engaged early and continuously, iterative execution becomes safer rather than riskier. Decisions are reviewed in context, not retroactively justified. When QA is not at the table early, as depicted in the slide, teams often proceed with assumptions about acceptable evidence only to face late-stage rework, rejustification, or rejection that drives delay and erodes confidence in the approach. Project controls need to evolve as well. Instead of tracking progress by document milestones, teams should focus on flow efficiency, how smoothly work moves from design to execution to approval. These shifts do not require major organizational restructuring. They require new collaboration patterns and shared accountability for outcomes. When organizations align around flow instead of handoff, iterative C&Q becomes sustainable rather than heroic. While iteration is primarily a mindset and governance shift, the right tools are essential to sustain it, especially at scale. Iterative C&Q is extremely difficult to maintain using spreadsheets, static documents, and manual reconciliation processes. Construction management platforms with integrated digital commissioning capabilities, along with digital validation tools, allow verification to occur during construction and installation activities rather than weeks later during documentation closeout. Evidence is generated where the work happens, not created afterward. Automated traceability is equally important. When requirements, risks, and verification results are digitally linked, changes propagate automatically. This eliminates the end of project effort spent reconciling disconnected documents and resolving traceability gaps under pressure. Workflow automation enables rolling reviews and incremental approvals without losing governance or visibility. Reviews happen when information is fresh and decisions are documented in context rather than long after execution. The key point is that tools do not replace quality judgment or risk management. They support it. When tools are aligned with an iterative execution model, they make good practices easier to execute and easier to defend during inspection. This slide shows how iterative C&Q works when applied end-to-end on a real project. The URS is developed early to establish intended use with the understanding that it may evolve as design choices mature and risks are refined. These changes are controlled, traceable, and deliberate, not ad hoc revisions. Vendor documentation is submitted in smaller, rolling packages rather than large batches. Subject matter experts review documentation immediately while context is high and vendor engagement is active. This improves review quality and reduces rework. Verification is executed as soon as elements become testable. That may be at the component level, subsystem level, or functional level, depending on risk. Verification timing is driven by testability, not by arbitrary phase boundaries. As verification is completed, traceability updates automatically. There is no end of project reconciliation exercise to rebuild relationships between requirements, risk, and testing. The project moves forward continuously with far fewer stop-start points. This flow is what removes C&Q from the critical path and replaces urgency with predictability. A critical takeaway from this discussion is that you do not need a large-scale transformation to begin working iteratively. Meaningful progress can start on your next project. Begin with a single system or an area where C&Q routinely becomes schedule constrained. Introduce iterative design reviews that focus on risk and maturity rather than document completeness. Enable rolling vendor documentation review instead of waiting for full packages to be assembled. Engage QA earlier and treat them as partners in execution timing, not just reviewers at the end. Where possible, use digital traceability tools to reduce manual effort and improve transparency across requirements, risks, and verification. These steps are intentionally small, but their efforts are immediate. Teams experience less congestion, better coordination, and clearer decision-making very quickly. Resistance drops once benefits become visible. Iteration works best when it begins incrementally and expands organically. Starting small builds confidence, preserves compliance, and creates momentum that supports wider adoption. To sustain iterative C&Q, it's important to measure outcomes that matter to both quality and project leadership. Without metrics, iteration can be dismissed as subjective preference rather than objective improvement. One of the most powerful indicators is the percentage of verification completed prior to mechanical completion. This metric directly shows where C&Q has moved off the critical path. Reductions in late phase defects, deviations, and rework are equally important. These are outcomes leadership understands intuitively and values immediately. Fewer late surprises translate directly into lower risk and smoother startup. Tracking overall C&Q duration improvements is also valuable, but it should always be viewed in the context of overall project performance rather than isolation. Together, these measures shift the discussion from, are we allowed to work this way, to why wouldn't we work this way? Organizations applying iterative C&Q principles are seeing consistent and repeatable results. These outcomes are not isolated success stories or dependent on exceptional teams. Qualification durations are routinely reduced by 20 to 30%. Verification activities begin earlier, late phase congestion is reduced, and overall execution becomes more predictable. Defects are identified earlier in the life cycle when corrective actions are simpler, less costly, and less disruptive. As a result, deviation volumes decrease and quality outcomes improve. Start activities are smoother because verification is largely complete before the pressure of operational deadlines sets in. Teams are no longer balancing system readiness and document closeout simultaneously. What's important is that these results are achieved using existing regulatory frameworks, not by bending or bypassing them. Iterative C&Q scales because it aligns with how systems actually mature while remaining inspection ready. Risk management is a foundation that keeps iterative C&Q disciplined, feasible, and compliant. Without it, iteration can quickly become uncontrolled or inconsistent. In an iterative model, risk assessment evolves along with design and system understanding. Early risks guide where verification should begin, and as risks are retired or refined, verification strategy adjusts accordingly. Risk determines not only what to verify, but also when to verify and how much depth is required. High-risk elements are verified as early as possible, while lower-risk aspects can wait until later maturity without increasing exposure. This approach prevents both under-testing and over-testing. Verification effort is scaled deliberately instead of evenly distributed. Risk becomes a living decision-making tool rather than a static document created to justify past choices. Iteration without risk management leads to chaos. Risk management without iteration leads to bureaucracy. Together, they create balance and control. Looking forward, the industry is steadily moving toward true continuous verification. The boundaries between design, qualification, and operation will continue to blur, but in a constructive way. Digital twins will increasingly enable predictive testing before equipment arrives on site. System behavior can be evaluated virtually, reducing uncertainty earlier in the life cycle. Artificial intelligence and machine learning tools will support anomaly detection, trend analysis, and automated evidence capture during operation. Verification will increasingly be embedded into routine execution rather than treated as a distinct event. This future does not represent a departure from regulatory principles, it represents a maturation of them. Maintaining alignment between specifications, system behavior, and data over time rather than freezing assurance at startup. Validation becomes continuous, not one and done, strengthening long-term compliance and product quality. To summarize, iterative C&Q supported by operational readiness fundamentally changes how projects execute. It removes C&Q from the critical path by distributing verification across the life cycle rather than concentrating it at the end. It aligns completely with ISPE Baseline Guide 5 and GAMP 5 when those guides are applied as written. The result is fast delivery, higher quality evidence, and improved inspection readiness. Projects become more predictable, teams operate under less stress, and quality outcomes improve. This is not a conceptual model or an inspirational future state. This is a proven, repeatable approach already in use around the industry. The shift is not about new requirements, it's about better timing, better focus, and smarter use of the guidance we already trust. I want to close with a practical and realistic call to action, especially for a webinar audience. I'm not suggesting that you redesign your entire validation framework or overhaul your quality system. That is rarely feasible and often unnecessary. Instead, reflect on your current or recent projects and ask a simple question. Where does C&Q consistently become a constraint rather than a contributor? Identify where verification is delayed due to habit, batching, or legacy practice rather than genuine risk. Look for one opportunity where verification can occur earlier during construction, FAT, SAT, or document review without increasing regulatory exposure. Engage engineering, QA, and operations in that discussion. Use ISPE Baseline Guide 5 and GAMP 5 as support, not as justification. These principles are already endorsed. Iterative C&Q does not start with tools or mandates. It starts with better conversations, better timing decisions, and better use of information we already have. Now, we have another poll question, which Paige will introduce.
There you go. I had to take myself off mute. So Eric, thanks for that. Now, Eric just gave us a bit of a call to action here. So how are you feeling? Do you see at least one project where you could begin benefiting from this iterative C&Q approach in the next 90 days? So let's see what the audience thinks. So Eric, did we take bets on well, what do you think our numbers are going to be this time?
Oh, this is difficult. I say 60%.
Well, I think you're an optimist.
Well, maybe.
I think we can do it, right? I think we can do it. We just have to think differently about how we approach it. And then we have to look at our procedures to ensure that we haven't boxed ourselves into a corner, correct? but I think it's definitely doable. Okay, let's see if we've had enough time here. Let's see what our results are. Oh, Eric, you are on fire. You are on fire today. Congratulations. Very good. Exactly. I think definitely doable. The concern I think that a lot of us have is have our procedures not by intent, maybe boxed us into where we feel like we can't do some of this work, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, and maybe I think we're ready to take a couple of questions.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna pop back on and just thank you both so much for that wonderful presentation. I want to just remind the audience that if you have not submitted a question yet, you still have time to do so now through that Ask a Question box. And I'm gonna bring our speakers back on, and we are going to get to our first audience question. And that question is asking, if requirements, specifications, and verification evidence are going to evolve as living artifacts, what practical mechanisms make that possible in day-to-day work, whether that's tooling, review practices, traceability, or team behaviors? And how is that different from how documents are typically managed today? Who can help with that one? Who wants to start?
Okay, I'll be happy to take that one. The whole iterative process can be enabled without digital commissioning and validation tools, but it will be really challenging and will take considerable overhead to do that. To be really practical, in order to support living artifacts, we need to think beyond the document-centric paradigm. Mm-hmm. We need to look at requirements, specifications, and verifications, not as documents, but as entities. And we need to manage change around the entities in a risk-based fashion. The tooling needed to really make this model successful has to be able to manage requirements, specifications, and verifications as entities while preserving the document model that the industry and the regulators expect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Now, this next audience question is asking, at the end of the day, regulators still expect a clear, defensible qualification package. In an iterative model, how does that final package compare to what inspectors are used to seeing today? Who can help with this one?
So, Eric, I'll take that one. So, at the end of the day, the inspectors are looking to see your testing package. So whether or not you do that in an iterative approach or you do it in a traditional approach, you still have a verification package and a testing package to show the inspector. So I don't think anything would change there unless, Eric, you think differently.
No, yeah. I agree.
Okay, wonderful. Is that good with that one? Should we move on?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Let's head back to the audience questions. This next one is asking, you walked us through a stick-built system example. How should the audience think, excuse me, how should the audience think about applying these same iterative verification principles to packaged equipment where vendor documentation and FAT play a bigger role?
Okay. That's a very good question. And I think the key success factor for this model to work for packaged equipment is supplier engagement. It's got to be clear in the statement of work that FAT will not just be a procurement and engineering checkbox. The vendor can be requested to produce an FAT verification document, but the statement of work must clearly state what kinds of verifications are expected to be conducted at FAT and what aspects or parts of the turnover records are required to be delivered at that time of the FAT to satisfy those verifications. So supplier engagement and supplier management is often not in the core competency, let's say, of a lot of the engineering groups that are often required to manage these type of projects. So.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Now, the next audience question is asking you, how would the procedures and training verification be completed using this iterative approach? That's from Mike.
So Eric, I was wondering if maybe you could use the example of the wiki system.
Well, yeah, I mean, early development of procedures and training are definitely an OR aspect, I would say, right? Mm-hmm. So as an OR, I think it's the training can develop iteratively while the commissioning is engaging, right? There are lessons being learned. The SOPs can be developed iteratively, and yes. You know, this is often a lot of these projects are new greenfield projects. They don't want to bring on FTEs too early in the project. If you've ever on these capital projects, they don't want to bring the full-time, and a lot of times the knowledge that's learned during the commissioning and qualification aspects are lost to the organization when the C&Q firm and the CMs leave. So if we are able to engage during those activities and have the vendors deliver training while during the commissioning phase, I think that's one way to potentially move some of that to the left.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Paige?
No, I totally agree with Eric.
Oh, perfect. I think we have time for one more question. And so let's go with this one. So this audience member comments, I like your point on metrics tracking. That said, project schedules and dashboards are historically centered on documents, which are easy to track. Can you comment on how project status and progress tools should be adjusted to support the continuous method in a way that still feels manageable? How about this one?
So Eric, I think, definitely leaning on some of our digital tools certainly help us in this scenario, for sure. Have you seen this tracked manually, or is it mostly in the digital space?
I think it's easier to do in the digital space, of course, right? If you have an early test planning, for example, if you're baking your test planning actually real far up front, like in your validation planning, you know essentially what verifications have to have for WIFI. I mean, we do this all the time. So the verification. So you're able to, as those get checked off, right, electronically in your DVT, your digital validation tool, your commissioning support system, it would be more of a percentage of verification. You can have a very clear metric for percentage of verification, provided you've done your test planning up front.
Great.
Okay. Very good. Well, I think that is our time. We've come to the top of the hour. I want to thank everyone, including our speakers, for joining us today, for giving that excellent information. Thanks to you, the audience. If we did not get to your question, no worries. We're going to forward that on to our presenters, and they can answer those offline. Just a reminder, this presentation will be available to you on demand. You'll receive a link via email as soon as it's available. That's it for us. Have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.